Michael Ainslie, my very close friend of 55 years. He's going to discuss his memoir, Nose for Trouble, which I recommend to you as a remarkable story of dealing successfully with both personal and unique business challenges. He's had an extraordinary career, not only as a leader who added huge value to the companies he worked with, but as a builder of important nonprofits. Michael was the CEO of Sotheby's from 1984 to 1994. In that 10-year period, he built a strong international team, compounded earnings by 25% per year, and took the company public. Michael, you may want to comment later, or if it comes up in the Q&A, on the price fixing your successor's scheme. Although that's not the thrust of what you're talking about, but it is probably on people's mind. As a member of the board of Lehman Brothers in 2008, when it went through bankruptcy, Michael had a front row seat at the beginning of the 2008 Great Recession. And I thought it was pretty interesting and maybe even unique that the head of the bankruptcy court asked Michael to stay on as head of a new board with some other board members to help recover the assets for the creditors of Lehman Brothers. And I think, Michael, you may comment on some lessons learned from that period for what we're going through now. In the mid-1990s, Michael and Suzanne moved from New York City to Palm Beach as a safe place to raise their young daughter. Since then, Michael spent his time well as an entrepreneur and continued as an active nonprofit leader. And Michael will talk a little bit about the Posse Foundation, which has provided scholarships for hundreds of inner city kids who are selected for their extraordinary leadership potential. He just turned 78, but does not seem to be slowing down.
77 yesterday.
77, excuse me, I added ones, 77. But he doesn't seem to be slowing down. Last year, he completed a fundraising effort totaling almost $10 million, including a $5 million lead donor for a new recreation center in Palm Beach, which opened earlier this year. And maybe during the Q&A, I'll bring that back up, Michael, as it has some, as a model for Basalt. We met after college when we each won a World Traveling Fellowship. It's sponsored by Corning Glasswork. So through that, we spent months around the world traveling off and on together. In the summer of 1966, he worked 2 months in South Vietnam on a complicated project to rationalize the wage labor rates for a large construction company, and survived some very scary moments flying around Vietnam in small planes when the war was already roaring. After graduating from business school in 1968, Michael joined McKinsey & Company, built a $150 million resort in Puerto Rico, where he worked with Jim Chafin and with me, and was the president of the Trust for Historic Preservation. We can all learn a lot about overcoming adversity, as he did in his early life when he had Addison's disease in his junior year in high school. So Vanderbilt withdrew his basketball scholarship and gave him an academic scholarship. Michael, you were here at the beginning of the Roaring Fork Club as a founder member. Welcome back.
Thank you, Jim. I got off light. He only gave me 1 extra year and none of the bad stories that he's got in his back pocket. But I really am enjoying this opportunity to see a lot of good friends and some new friends, and to be back in touch with the Roaring Fork Club, where we were founding members. How many years ago, Jim, was it? 20?
20 plus in 1997.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to prove that Jim and I did go around the world together, I'm going to show you a picture here. I'm going to try something called screen sharing. And here's the book of my book. By the way, how did you get the name A Nose for Trouble? I was talking to an old friend here in Palm Beach, and he was asking me about the book, and I kept telling him about all the difficulties I'd gotten into over my life. And he said, Michael, you have a nose for trouble. I said, you've just named my book. because it turns out that virtually every decade I've either had a life-threatening or a financially life-threatening experience. Now here is a guy on the far right of this picture. Can you all see this? Jim, can you see it?
Yes, I can see it.
We can see it.
Well, that smiling guy beside the gorgeous Egyptian young woman, whose name is Zizette, is Jimmy Light, with a lot of good hair and a good smile. And the guy staring up at the belly dancer is yours truly, Michael. This was in 1966. We ended up meeting this family in Cairo, and this was the Nasser's famous nightclub, the Auberge des Pyramides. And we obviously had a pretty good table. Somehow this photo has lasted for 50 some years. I'm going to flip through. I've never done this before at a book talk, but I'm going to flip through a few photos, and these are all in the book, and they'll bring back some great memories for me, and I'll tell you a few stories. This was David Rockefeller when I was at the National Trust. We inherited, when Nelson died, their family property up in Westchester, Pecanico Hills, better known as Kikit, and that's Governor Cuomo, the earlier Governor Cuomo, and Happy Rockefeller and John Rockefeller's widow. This was the day that they gave 95 acres and 16 million for endowment to the National Trust after about 2 years of tough negotiating. Anyway, a few other, this is a wonderful story. My first wife, Lucy, and I with Barbara Bush, on the day that President Reagan was shot, Barbara Bush had told the story in the newspaper that she didn't have any place for George to keep his shirts. So we gave her a loan of this chest, Victorian chest that's standing behind her. And it was this day that Nancy Reagan was there in our dining room, and I was giving a talk about trying to get her to join the National Main Street program, which was one of our many successful programs. Unfortunately, she said no, but as she left our house, the caterer came running from the kitchen and said, President Reagan's been shot. So that was quite a traumatic moment. I'll move along here, a few other stories, but this was the day, the week we took Sotheby's public at the New York Stock Exchange. It happened to be a day that Reagan was visiting, and I had just had surgery for Dupuytren's, my right hand there, as you can see, and it turns out Reagan had had the same thing. So we had a nice chat about our comparative stories. I want to go to Sotheby's and talk a little bit about it. This is a picture of two of my key directors at Sotheby's. On the right is Henry Ford, the grandson of the great founder of the Ford Motor Company. And on the left is Baron Hans Heinrich von Thyssen-Bornemisza. Heine Thyssen, many of you probably have seen the great Thyssen Museum in Madrid. That is the collection that he and his family, his father mainly, formed over a couple of centuries. These two gentlemen, believe it or not, both are grandsons of supporters of Hitler. Thyssen was the great ThyssenKrupp steel company from Germany and the Eastern Europe. And of course, Henry Ford, the Ford Motor Company. They were both, their grandfathers were both anti-Semites and were supporters of Hitler, if you can believe it. And then 40 years later, only 40 years later, we sat repeatedly every month at a board table, which was chaired by Alfred Taubman, an East German Jew, was populated by Max Fisher, a wonderful gentleman, one of my very best friends and supporters who passed away, Jewish as well. Les Wexner is well Jewish, and two or three other Jewish. And they were all great friends. I think it proves that things can change in in a generation or two. What did we do at Sotheby's? I inherited a company that was quite poorly run. In fact, there's a misnomer called British management. I think Paul Shang would agree with that. There's no such thing as British management. And so we had a lot of fixing to do. I spent the better part of my decade there getting the company back in great shape, and we made it into a very successful worldwide business. But sadly, my successor, Dee Dee Brooks, engaged in price fixing with Christie's. And they, I'm going to take it off of the slide, the screen sharing for the moment. Dee Dee Brooks literally met hundreds of times, we don't know how many times, with the CEO of Christie's. And there was a set of documents that were 500 pages long of illegal agreements. They agreed on a fixed commission structure that would be non-negotiable. They agreed on non-poaching of employees. They listed Christie's clients on one side of the paper and Sotheby's clients on the other, and they were not to be poached. It was a comprehensive industry fixing arrangement. It went on for 5 years after I left, and all this negotiating was going on, and they were implementing these rules with each other. And finally, the chairman of Christie's decided, who happens to be a wealthy Frenchman named Francois Pinault, he still owns the company, he decided to fire the CEO of Christie's. And in that deed, Chris Davidge, the Christie's CEO, had kept all these documents. He sends about 10 pages of them to Pinault and says, if you want the rest of these, it's going to cost you 10 million pounds as a severance package. Pinault, I'm sure, looked at his options and he said, holy shit, if this gets out by Sotheby's, if they've got these same documents and they turn it out, we're in deeper trouble. So he paid the 10 million pounds to Chris Davidge. They sent him to a US lawyer and they raced to the Justice Department, beating Dee Dee Brooks by a day or two. And the rest is a bit of history I won't go into, but I detail in some more detail in the book. Dee Dee blamed Al Taubman for making her do it, said that he made her do it to keep her job. And I tell in the book about 6 or 7 stories about why I don't think that's true. Al Taubman was no saint, but he never once overruled me on anything that was important, and he never once did anything against the interest of the company. So I think that that's where my opinion goes in, and I had a good libel lawyer to make sure I made it clear that I don't know what happened between the two of them, but I think my knowledge of the pattern of behavior of Al Taubman doesn't say to me that he, quote, made her do this. Anyway, that's a little bit about Sotheby's. There's a lot in the book about it. Probably it's my longest chapter, several chapters, because frankly, it was the most fascinating business endeavor I've ever been involved with. The big story there is that we were selling to the wrong customer. We were selling to art dealers, and Al Taubman bought the company with the idea of we can sell to private collectors. So our sales went from 500 million to 3 billion in 5 years. Our profits went, as Jim said, up dramatically. Actually was a 10-year compound return on Al's investment of 31%. So it was a great run, and I really had a great deal of fun doing it. I want to go to Lehman. Hank Paulson will not like my book. I think Hank Paulson made a huge mistake in letting Lehman go bankrupt. I have a book here I'm going to hold up for you. I hope those of you that are serious about history, financial history, will write this down. It's called The Fed and Lehman Brothers, and it's written by the Dean of Economics at Johns Hopkins. His name is Lawrence Ball. This is 200 pages. It's not that long or difficult to read, but he makes the case that there was completely adequate collateral for the Federal Reserve to have financed Lehman Brothers. Paulson and his team made a decision that they would sacrifice Lehman because they wanted to make very sure they could save AIG. Many of you were in the world of finance, you know all this probably, but in my strong opinion, it was possible to save both. And I want to bring it, as Jim said, bring it back to what's happening right now. I'm not a big supporter of our president, but I will say this, his Secretary of the Treasury is doing a fabulous job. I think Mnuchin's initiatives to finance companies, to help small business, he's been quick, he's been comprehensive. There's still a lot more to do. This is a horrible period of time for our country, but I do think that Mnuchin is doing a great job, and I think, frankly, I think they learned from the 2008 crisis. We did not have to go into the deep depression or near depression that we did in 08. I don't think that the Lehman shareholders should have had much left over. There should have been a major dilution, maybe 90%, but there should not have been a bankruptcy. Lehman had 1,300,000 derivative contracts in place. The complexity of banks and counterparties, Paul Shang's eyes are glazing over because he knows how bad it was. He had just left Lehman Brothers. But that could have been avoided had Paulson made the tougher decision of keeping both alive. And I think if he had gone to Congress with a clear explanation of the ramifications, he could have done it. So there's a lot in the book about Lehman Brothers. For example, this is one of the most, frankly, disgusting facts. The Tuesday before we declared bankruptcy, Jamie Dimon had a meeting with Paulson in Washington. That much is known. What they talked about is not known. However, after the meeting, Dimon demanded from Lehman, they were our clearing bank, they demanded $8.4 billion of new collateral be posted by Lehman Brothers. Literally taking a lot of our liquidity out of Lehman. And why did he do it? He must have been told something by Paulson that they were planning to bankrupt Lehman. Nobody knows because they weren't in the meeting, but the action certainly implies that. So I think there was I'll finally close on the Lehman side with the fact that Fuld and Paulson were not good friends. They did not like each other. Paulson felt Lehman, that Fuld hadn't done enough to try and get a new investor, a new partner for Lehman. Back in the days of long-term capital management, Fuld had refused to put up the kind of money that Paulson wanted Lehman to put in. Finally, belatedly, he put in 100 million instead of 250 million, which was what Paulson wanted him to do. So there was a lot of bad blood there, and I think, unfortunately, that was a factor. Let me go to Posse. Jim mentioned Posse, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. I want to go back to screen sharing because I want to show you something. Okay. This is my my Posse gang. I retired as chairman of the board. I was the first chairman for about 15 years, and this was my retirement party. I know every one of these kids, young people, almost like my own children. This woman teaches at Yale Medical School. This guy's an entrepreneur in the Bronx with a wine business and an art importing business. This guy's a partner at Weil Gotshal. This woman is a partner at an entertainment law firm. This gal down here is the CEO and principal owner of Uniworld Group, the largest multicultural ad agency in the world. She's a technology expert at the Federal Reserve. This guy's a comedian in LA. Jamal Nelson is a big story in my book. He's an ordained minister, went to Harvard Divinity after Vanderbilt. These two guys are at Posse now as senior executives. These are young leaders, and Posse began when this woman, Debbie Beal, founded Posse 30 years ago. This was last year at the gala, 30th anniversary gala at the Metropolitan Museum. And Debbie met a young man who said, I would never have dropped out of college if I'd had my posse with me. She said, what's a posse? He said, my buddies, my guys and gals that back me up. Well, she had the good fortune of good sense to call a friend at Vanderbilt, professor there, and he said, we'll take a gamble on a bunch of kids from New York. Those kids, one of them was a woman named Shirley Collado, Dominican cab driver's daughter from Brooklyn. Shirley went on and got a PhD at Duke in clinical psychology, went into academe, was dean of the college at Middlebury, is now the president of Ithaca College at age 45. She's now on the board of Vanderbilt and just was on the search committee to find and bring in the new chancellor of Vanderbilt. That's what Posse's all about, is finding young leaders, putting them in, Posse has now expanded to 57 universities. 57 leading institutions in the country take 10 kids a year that we identify in now 10 cities all over the country, give them full scholarships, so that we have now raised $1.5 billion in scholarships. 9,200 kids have gone to university on this program, and 90% of them graduate. So all I can say is I've had more fun with Posse and more satisfaction than I can ever imagine. That's really the highlights of some of the parts of my book. There's a lot about tennis in there. Polly Scott's late husband, Gene Scott, is featured in the story. There are lots of stories about Jim Light and Jim Chafin. It really was fun putting this together. So I encourage any of you that have ever thought about writing a book to do it. It's a lot more fun to have finished it. As someone said, it's more fun to have written than it is to write. But it's been a lot of fun. I've gotten back in touch with more friends and more people than I could have ever dreamed about. So that's a good start. Why don't we unmute, or you all raise a hand and unmute yourself and shoot a few questions at me.
So I'll start, since I'm in a different room than you. So
that's my wife, Suzanne.
I thought it'd be better in a different screen. But so what was your favorite thing on your travels around the world with Jim Light and without Jim Light? And what did you learn from that experience? Since right now, I think the Corning Fellowship is not happening because of what's happened here.
Suzanne knows that we at Vanderbilt, we've kept the Corning Fellowship going. It's called the Keegan now because one of our former fellows endowed it a few years ago, or at least partially endowed it. And we gave 2 fellowships in February for 2 really bright young people, but they've been told they can't go this year because of the virus. So they have the chance to put it off for a year and go next year, but I don't know if they'll be able to do that given their school plans and so on. What was my favorite moment? Well, I'll tell the rest of the story that Jim told. My favorite moment was landing in a plane that had lost one of its 2 engines in Pleiku in the middle of the war in Vietnam. And the reason it was my happiest was because I was still alive. The pilot said, I looked over at him as we were circling. We were doing a corkscrew landing because the Viet Cong were everywhere around. And I said, are we going to land? Are we going to make it? He said, Mike, don't worry. We can land this thing on 1 engine. Just be glad it wasn't tomorrow morning when we were taking off, because we can't take off on 1. So that was my happiest. What about you, Jim?
Well, we traveled together off and on. And one of the interesting people that we had contacts with, or Michael did, was David Halberstam. He had written a book on Vietnam called The Making of a Quagmire, and I think he'd sort of
the brightest.
He'd done it there, or done himself in Vietnam, so to speak.
Right, the best
He was in Poland, and he was. So Michael had an introduction to him. He was married to the equivalent of Marilyn Monroe, who was a woman who had a stage and movie career. and we were invited to their home for dinner. And what I learned about that and had no clue about, having grown up in a small town in West Virginia, was the anti-Semitism that continued in Poland. This was 1966. So that's the kind of, we found that people would be willing to meet us and sometimes invite us to dinner. And we always hear some interesting story about what was going on. But that was certainly an example. The Egyptian family had been a general under King Farouk. And so he invited us in, and we found out what he was interested in was getting
Jim Freeman and John Harris
introduced to America, because he didn't think there was any future. And we ended up getting him a job, and he became an American citizen, went in the U.S. Army. He's now back in Cairo, but it's a family we've kept up with all these years. So there was some very interesting educational things in the broadest sense for us, and some very good personal experiences.
North Carolina.
Lee, we're getting your conversation there as a little background.
I'm sorry, Mike.
Lee was a classmate of Jim's and mine at Harvard Business School, along with Brian Fitzgerald, who Helen's iPad is here. I think that's Helen Fitzgerald. Are you there, Helen? She's muted, but anyway, Lee, did you have a question?
I did, Mike. I was very interested in your comments about the situation at Lehman Brothers. Coincidentally, I've been in a board meeting all day, and one of the issues has been how much outside directors know in publicly held corporations and what the liability is. What was your perception of the way in which Lehman directors were well informed about some of the subprime liabilities and so forth that manifest themselves?
Well, you never know enough, and you clearly are told what the management wants you to know. We had a very good board. It was a small board of only 10 of us, a very bright group of people, and our problem was not subprime. We had very little subprime. Our problem was way too much investment in illiquid real estate, mainly commercial real estate and some development property, which, you know, the last straw was buying Archstone, which was a $22 billion deal, which was existing luxury apartments, but then we couldn't resell it and syndicate it. Got 2 tenths. We didn't know enough. We were told we had hedges against a lot of the risks, and when it all went down, those hedges did not hold up. So I would say we were trying to, you know, one of the interesting things is there was called a bankruptcy examiner's report done, which is done in any big bankruptcy. They hired a firm from Chicago, Jenner and Block, I think that's called. The report was headed by a guy named Anton Valukas. This is hard to believe, but to put together, he had to piece together what happened with Lehman. Could you believe this? It cost, to do that study, to do that reconstruction, $100 million. That's how complicated the bloody thing was. And it took 1.5 years. And he came back and he said, nobody did anything illegal here. Yes, there was too much leverage. That's not illegal. The federal government, the SEC, knew everything that Lehman was doing. Their marks to market were correct in most cases. They said 1 or 2 were too high and 1 or 2 were too low. So, you know, it was a political decision. That was a mistake. I do think the leverage that banks have been required to be much less leveraged, and that's why they're a lot healthier now. And even though they're going to lose a lot of money on loans in this current crisis, they're going to be fine, in my opinion. And I think so. I think there were a lot of good things that came out of the new regulations.
Hey, Mike, this is Chris Reither.
Yes.
I'm an insurance broker, and what's your viewpoint on if they had bankrupted AIG instead? And is it a fact that the government got all their money back and a return on it?
Well, the answer to your last question is they got back all their investment, which was over $80 billion, and they made 22 billion on the trade. So yes, they got a good profit on the investment, which they would have done if they had bought 90% of the equity of Lehman. Lehman's assets we tripled the value. Jim commented, I chaired what's called the Lehman estate, which is like the dead body, the Lehman bankrupt company for the next 6 years. And we tripled the value of the assets. There were very good assets if you had time for markets to recover, which we were able to do. Frankly, had they bankrupted AIG, it would have probably bankrupted Goldman Sachs, because AIG owed Goldman at least 12 billion. I think it may have been more. And it could well have taken all the firms down. They in that regard, Paulson was right. He couldn't afford to let AIG go under. It was simply too big.
Michael?
Yes.
Richard Broussard talking to you from South Louisiana.
Hey there.
If you look back and you had to find something in the way that the federal government regulates financial institutions and fix it, what would it be? I hear bankers complaining continuously about the trouble they have. And I don't mean right now, I mean 30 years. I've heard bankers say, you can't believe how much trouble the federal regulatory agencies are for bankers. And I don't talk to brokers about that. But I'm just wondering what can be fixed in something that everybody's been complaining about for so long.
Well, I have to be honest. I'm not close enough to the banking industry now to give you a good answer today. I will tell you this, the federal government's push to get everybody to own a house was the biggest mistake that was made. The relaxation of lending standards back 12 years ago, 15 years ago, which created the subprime crisis, was, that was where government, and it was, Barney Frank and a lot of congressmen were begging banks to lend more aggressively. And I mean, you all know, you're of an age where you know what happened to people that had no business getting a mortgage. I mean, Suzanne works at Sotheby's Realty. She tells me one day, she comes home and says, there's a guy in here trying to sell 105% mortgages. They want to lend plus, everything plus more.
I'm 10%.
110? Well, it's what happened in Japan. When I was at Sotheby's, the banks in Japan would go out to wealthy individuals and some that were crooks and say, go buy art at Sotheby's, we'll lend you 100% of whatever you pay. Not of value, but whatever you pay. So that was part of our success in the market rise in the 80s and 90s, was a lot of people buying art on leverage. Well, you know what happened in Japan? It went crash in 1990, and it hasn't budged. I mean, they have not been able to refinance their financial institutions. They haven't been able to get their economy going. I just hope we're not going in for that kind of a time frame in our country, but it's not clear.
Michael, Frida Wallison is on, or was earlier, her husband, Peter, wrote a tome before the crash warning about the federal policy and encouraging too much lending to people that shouldn't be borrowing. So he forecasted in the early, several years before it happened, early 2000s.
I wish they had listened.
Michael?
Hi, Jane.
Hi, I'm thinking about Posse right now because the gala that you have been at for as long as I've known you should be happening in a week. So, we're all thinking about the changing world and, Serena's graduating, Margot still has another year of college. But I'm curious if you've had discussions with your Posse network about, there are going to be a lot of headwinds in education. And how is that going to trickle down to the kids on scholarships like the Posse students? And I just see a really tough landscape ahead. And Posse's going to get drawn into it somehow.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. We had a Posse board meeting, a virtual meeting like this about 3 weeks ago, our spring meeting in late mid to late April. And we discussed the fact that, we have in those 57 universities, there are some of the greatest ones, Cornell and Vanderbilt and Brandeis, and Duke's not one of them yet, but
Well,
Smith is. There also are a number of what I would call smaller, middle, not mid-level, but certainly liberal arts colleges that are not well endowed, and they've got huge financial problems. So I think that Posse will shrink. I think there'll be a number of schools that will have to basically say, we can't give the scholarships anymore. Hopefully they'll honor the ones they've already given, since they have a 5-year contract with us. It's renewed regularly. But it's going to be a very tough time. My successor at Posse was a fellow some of you may know named Jeff Ubben. Jeff is the was the founder of a big private equity firm in LA and San Francisco called Value Act Investing. Has been very, very successful. And Jeff and his father led an endowment campaign for Posse. And so we have about $80 million of endowment, which for a small, relatively startup nonprofit, 30 years is not a startup, but it's certainly early days still. We've got a pretty strong balance sheet, and we'll be able to strategize and adjust and shrink. We've already frozen everything because we don't know what the future holds exactly. But we'll be okay, and the program will continue, but I think it probably will be a bit smaller in the near future. Hopefully, higher ed can come out of this. I think it's one of the most challenged industries out there because they've got to have students paying tuition come September.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Michael, if there are other questions, I'll wait, but
David Sobelman, I see a hand.
Yeah. Hi, Mr. Ainslie. Nice to meet you. I'm also in Florida, so thank you. Can I call you Gogo?
Yes, you may. Look at that.
Well, you write in your book about the conference call you had with the SEC chair, I believe. And I'd like to hear what you remember about some of the dialogue in the room above what you talked about in the book.
Well, thank you. It's nice to have somebody who's read the book. That was the way I started the book, actually. We were sitting in the Lehman boardroom late on that Sunday night, and Chris Cox was the chairman of the SEC at that point. And we were in a great big long boardroom with a big table, and he called and he said, I don't want to speak to the CEO, I want to speak to the entire board. And so there's a speaker phone up in the ceiling, and suddenly this voice comes on and he starts lecturing us. And he says, okay, the market's about to open in Japan and in Asia, and you need to do what you need to do. Well, we knew what he was saying, which was this was the federal government telling Lehman to declare itself bankrupt. One of our directors is a really smart guy, former Arthur Andersen partner and a former CEO of Halliburton named Tom Cruikshank. And Tom Cruikshank, the big tall Texan, and he looks up at the ceiling. He says, "Is the federal government telling us to go bankrupt?" And Cox wouldn't answer that. He just said, "You just need to do what you need to do." But they were basically telling us to, and this is where it's so maddening, because there's something called the Primary Dealer Credit Facilities, PDCF, which is what banks use to fund themselves every night. We had plenty of assets to go to the PDCF, and that's what this guy, Larry Ball, writes about in depth. So they could have loaned to us and have kept Lehman going. Paulson simply didn't want to do it. And now this is the other part. Who's supposed to make those decisions? Not Paulson, Bernanke. He's the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He abdicated. He's not a strong leader. He's a very good academic, but he basically abdicated and let Paulson make the decision, and Paulson made a political decision. So there was a lot of other conversations. I won't go into all of them. Probably the sweetest one I write in the book, my daughter Serena, who I thought might be on tonight, but she's just graduated from Vanderbilt. She was home watching it on TV with Suzanne, and she said, "Mommy, if Daddy needs me to, I'll sell all my toys on eBay."
I remember reading that. I told my wife about that line. That was very, very sweet. Yeah. Thank you for answering. Yeah.
Thank you. Jim, what was your next question?
Well, now that you're 77, you've just finished a public-private partnership with the city of Palm Beach, which I think is a model for other communities, and including potentially for Basalt, where you got the city to put in a third, a donor to put in a third, and you raised a third of almost $15 million. Can you comment a little bit on that? Because I think for the Roaring Fork Club members, this may be instructive for something that there may be an opportunity in the future for the individuals and the town of Basalt to come together to do something important.
Well, it was an incredible journey. We had a spectacular, wonderful man named Morton Mandel from Cleveland, who lived here, and he was a good friend through Serena's school. I'd gotten to know his grandkids went there, and he'd given some money to the school. And he called me up one day and he said, "I love this town. It's been great to me and my family. How can I say thank you?" So I called around to the town council members, and they all said the same thing. "We need a new rec center. The one we have is mold ridden and 4 feet above sea level, and it's fallen down and built about 40 years ago." So I went back to Mort and I said, "We need a new rec center, but it's a $15 million project." He said, "I love it. I'll put up a third of the money." So that was the easiest fundraising part. The second part was the town said, "If you can raise the 2/3, we'll definitely put up the last third." But the middle part was the hard part, raising $5 million from people who basically could care less about a rec center. At least that's what they thought at the outset. So I spent with a partner named Matt Smith, who's a great guy here, became chairman of our nonprofit that we created. And we ended up with 125 families and foundations giving from 5,000, even 1,000, up to we got 2 or 3 gifts at 750,000. It was very hard work. But the rec center is opened, and I can't tell you how much it's meant to this town. Everybody loves it. The kids, there's a spectacular new playground. There's a new full-length soccer field that's been rebuilt, and it was there, but needed to be re-drained and irrigated and sodded. That was $750,000 of the budget. A new indoor gymnasium, a new fitness center, which we thought we'd get 150 members maybe in a full year. In the first 2 months, we had 180 people join, paying an annual fee for that. So it's been a home run for our town. And anybody that would like to come and see it, it'd be a great way to, we ought to get your somebody from Basalt to come here, because once you see this facility, you realize what it can do to a community.